Hey, this is Matt from Custom Car Grills with a mesh install for the mid-2010 Subaru Impreza and Crosstrek. Linked above and in the description is a video on how to easily remove the grill from the car to get caught up to where I am here. With the grill by itself, remove the emblem and then clip out the chrome wing that's around the logo. Remove the bezel too, but set that aside, we'll be reusing it again later. If you're not sure on how to separate these components, look on the back of the grill for some clips and then some screws along the top and sides. Full disclosure, we've seen some of these grills where the bezel is molded into the grill. With those grills, obviously the bezel can't be removed, but the rest of this video will still be relevant. With the main grill portion by itself, I'll next grab an open-ended saw blade and start cutting out the bulk of the center section. Starting in the upper corner and cutting down the side, I'm keeping my distance from the edge a little bit. Maybe a 1/4 inch away so that I don't cut into the edge and damage it. The lower edge is fairly easy to cut through since I can go right across the diamond intersections until I meet up with the cuts on the left and right side. Next up is the top edge, where there's just a handful of thin bars that are quick work. Then it's on to the solid lower section. Just keep a straight line going and don't rush through these steps. Getting good clean cuts here can save a little bit of time later on. The last of the handsaw cuts for me was the solid area on the top edge. I was able to get closer to the edge thanks to the small ribs in the design up there. With the big cuts made, the center section will lift out like so. Next, I'll grab my Dremel and equip it with their number 543 cutting and shaping wheel so I can refine my cuts down a little bit further. The top of the wheel is highly abrasive, and it's a great tool for slowly shaving down the remnants of the stock grill diamonds. I'm looking to get them short enough so that I can easily make a cut on the edge later without them being in the way. The upper corners had some extra material for me as well, so I spent a little bit of time knocking this down some. After that, I'll grab some masking tape. I had some 1/4 inch wide stuff available, which will make contouring easier than the wider tapes. This needs to be placed right in front of where the stock grill diamonds were, maybe spaced away about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch. What we're creating here is a cut line for our Dremel cutoff wheel. I ran this line all the way from the center of the grill to near the upper corners and just followed the natural curve of the grill. There is a tab here on the sides that will cause some issues with the mesh install. Instead of trying to cut around it, I just cut mine right off. When it comes to the edge cutting, I started at the top and just worked my way down and across. Sometimes this can be easier by doing the cuts in chunks, like I'm showing here. For long stretches on the same edge, I do sometimes like to get it done in one long stretch if possible. I find that the cut can be cleaner this way because there's not a noticeable start and stop point. Afterward, there will be some burn-on plastic bits, and these can usually be picked off by hand. If there's issues picking them off, they can be sanded down later. There's still some work needed to be done with the top edge, but I need to be careful not to cut through the holes for the bezel clips. To give me a guide as to where the holes are, I put a little bit of red tape in the areas that I do not want to cut. With the tape in place, I can now confidently make some cuts. These areas need to be trimmed up very close to the front and be in line with the depth of the surrounding thin areas. This is a fairly important step. There's no need to attempt a speed run on it. I'm just taking my time and making sure that I have a steady hand. Now we can try to link up the top edge with the left and right sides. These upper corners just need a little bit of tape to bridge the gap, and then I can get to cutting again. This is a somewhat awkward cut to make, and a couple different angles of approach might be needed to make the cut. While we have this flipped over, there's some thin little spines around the perimeter that need to be shaved down so that the mesh will sit flat on the back. The top of the shaping wheel is highly abrasive and will work well for shaving down these pieces down and out of the way. Of course, I need to be mindful as to where I'm using the Dremel wheel. I don't want to accidentally cut somewhere that I don't want to. These little things are all over the place, and if we miss one now, it's not a big deal. We can shave it down later on. With all of the big cuts made, the tape that was being used as a guide can be removed and thrown away. Here's a quick look at how my cuts look now. Overall, it's a good start, but there's some high spots and some areas that are a little uneven. To even out these spots, I'll grab some sandpaper. And while this step can be done by hand, I'm mainly using an air-powered dual-action sander to get this done a little bit quicker. I'll start on the top edge and get that thick solid area sanded down first. Though it's important not to sand down past the rest of the edge line, we want to preserve the consistent look in that region. Then I'll get to work on the left and right edges, working down the high spots and cleaning up the cut edge. I spotted a little area in the upper corners that was missed, so I'll get the Dremel back out again and just touch that up with the shaping wheel. In the end, I'm hoping to make that look like one cut that consistently gets thinner the higher up the cut line goes until we reach the upper corners. If the edge is a little wavy, this is the time to fix it up. A few passes of sanding should even out the line quickly. If we were doing this by hand, a sanding block would be a great tool to help get just the right contour compared to trying to freehand it. Here's how mine looks after a couple passes. Most everything is consistently even and flat, with a gradual taper on the sides up to the top. The only thing I spotted that I want to improve on is the back of the upper edge. When it comes time for the mesh install, we want the mesh to rest on the back of the edge fairly flat, so I'll push this edge up a little bit closer, like so. Okay, here's another look at the cut and sanded intersection. I'm satisfied with how everything is turning out, and it's time to get a little bit of paintwork going. Remember that bezel I took off earlier? Well, I don't like the look of the chrome, and I want to swap that out for a gloss black. In general, paint has a hard time sticking to chrome. Ideally, stripping it off completely is the way to properly do this. At a bare minimum though, I want to scuff this up so that the paint will adhere a little bit better. The dual action sander with 180 grit works for getting the surface roughed up. To fully strip the chrome, something a little bit more aggressive would need to be used. I'll just work my way around the perimeter, hitting every edge that will be seen on the finished product. This can take quite a bit of time to do, but it'll be worth it in the end. Next up, I'll grab myself a can of primer. For these jobs, I just used the Spray Max brand 1K Self-Etch Primer Filler. It dries fairly quickly and very smooth with one good coating. Here's how mine looks after being sprayed. I'll let it finish drying before moving on and doing the final paint and clear coat on it. In the meantime, let's go ahead and primer up the inner part of the grill. Again, I'm using the Spray Max 1K Self-Etch Primer Filler. And after a good coat of it, this is how mine's looking. Once that dries, I'll grab a can of the Spray Max 1K Matte Black Trim Paint. I sprayed on a couple coats of this and let it dry, and here's how it turned out. Overall, looks like a good consistent finish, and looks very OEM-like. Behind the scenes, I also painted the bezel. I wanted some contrast, so we went with a 2-stage gloss black finish, and here's a quick look at how all that turned out. Again, a very close to factory finish that will look great when it's on the vehicle. Let's go ahead and snap the bezel and inner portion back together. Just line the tabs up and press them together until we hear a snap. There's also a handful of screws to reinstall as well. Now, we're all set for the mesh install, and speaking of which, here's the mesh piece that we have for sale on our website. This is pre-cut and pre-bent specifically for the 2013 through 15 Crosstrek. But they can also be adapted to the 2016 through 17 Crosstrek, as well as the Imprezas of the same years with just a few tweaks. I'll show you that in a moment. For the 2013 through 15 Crosstrek, the mesh piece can be laid on the back of the grill like so, with no extra modification needed. To skip over the mods needed for the 2016-17 Crosstrek and Impreza, please go to about 12 minutes into this video to move on to the next step. With the other Crosstreks and Imprezas previously mentioned, here's what the cut grill should look like. These are a little bit deeper than the one I've been primarily showing. Flipped around, it also looks similar too, but with a few distinct differences that I'll show you. Just like with the main grill that we're working with, this mesh piece will lay on the back with ease. The three things to note are that the sides of the mesh are a little bit too wide here, and the upper corner has a bezel tab right here that the other grill does not. And lastly, the center tabs on the upper edge are spaced just a little bit differently. Next, I'll grab a silver Sharpie and mark where the excess mesh in the corners and upper edge area are. This will work as a guide on where I need to cut the mesh. Then I'll take the mesh back off and grab a pair of tin snips, which should cut through the mesh fairly well. I'm just simply cutting along the lines that I'd marked out. There's really not much cutting needed here at all. Both of these grills are very similar to each other. There's only a very minor difference. The alternative to cutting the mesh is to simply cut the grill bezel tabs. But I'm not a big fan of that approach because there's not many tabs holding this grill together, and I want to keep as many as possible. To address the width issue, there's a simple fix, and I'll just grab a sheet metal vice grip. If one of these is not available, a good pair of pliers could also be substituted in place. Just bend the mesh inward quite a bit, and that should resolve the issue. We want the mesh to be making contact with the edge so that we have an easier time bonding the mesh to the frame. This might take a couple tries to get it at just the perfect angle, but looks like I got lucky here on the first try. Here's a look at my grill, now with the modified mesh piece. This bent edge is now making gentle contact with the side. The upper corner will now allow the passage of the bezel tab, and the upper center tabs also have more room for a proper fit. Before moving on, I'll use an oil-based paint pen to touch up the cut edge so that the powder coat doesn't recede. The mesh is made of aluminum, so there's no risk of rusting. Now, let's get back to the original grill that we were using for the 2013 through 15 Crosstrek. To temporarily hold the mesh and grill frame together, I'll grab some cable ties and foam. The foam will help protect the finish on the grill bezel, while the ties will help draw the mesh closer to the back edge. The process is simple. All I need to do is feed the tail end of the tie through the mesh from the front and fasten it behind the mesh. For best results, I like to have the head of the tie resting on the back of the mesh, like so. And here's a better view of me fastening on a tie. It's also best to not loop the tie up too high, and while the ties need to be on tight to hold the mesh up flush against the bezel, it's best not to over tighten these to the point where the top and bottom edge of the grill frame is going to distort. The sides and the corners aren't much different than the top and bottom edges. There might be a little trial and error to find the best placement, but overall the attachment points should be fairly obvious. The top edge is the most delicate of the bunch. And make sure not to draw the ties in too tight in a manner where the top edge is going to droop down at all. It's important to get the mesh tight up against the back of the grill so that it doesn't have gaps later on. And before moving forward, I want to double check my work. Thus far, this is looking pretty good. The mesh seems to be fairly flush up against the back of the grill. Next, I'll come back with some wire cutters and snip off the tail ends of the ties and throw those away. To permanently bond all of this together, I'm going to use automotive goop. Though, other adhesives such as plyo grip can be used, or other two-part epoxies. To apply the goop, I'm simply using a toothpick to assist in dispensing it in and around the area where the mesh and grill come in contact. It's super important not to spill any of this through the front, and I'm taking my time just to make sure that I get full coverage. Again, the name of this glue is called Automotive Goop, and I'll have it linked in a card above right now. This stuff is a great weatherproof adhesive that I've been using for many years. It's cost effective as well, but there is one small drawback to it. This stuff takes a really long time to cure. Plan on letting this sit for a day while it cures. For this install, I used two 3.7 ounce tubes of goop over 2 applications over 2 days. Placing a fan nearby to blow on it can help speed up the process, but for the most part, this is just a matter of waiting. The fan also has another benefit of preventing the goop from running all over the place. With the side edge, there isn't a whole lot of material to get the adhesive in and around. I'm simply just doing my best to get as much in there as I can without spilling it over on either side. With this area, it's also important not to overfill the outside edge. If there's too much, it'll make reinstallation of the grill back on the bumper a little tougher. On the top edge, it's kind of the same deal. There's not much of an edge to dispense on here, but I'm trying to get as much on the mesh and grill as possible without spilling any through the front. Again, having a small fan blowing on this will help with the adhesive not running all over the place. On the next day, I came back to snip off the ties. I threw them away along with the protective foam, and the mesh install is now complete. Let's flip this around and check out how it looks. Wow, I can't believe how this turned out. This badgeless design is super clean. Here's a closer look, and I'm really impressed with how seamless the transition from mesh to grill frame is here. Of course, if owners want to add on custom emblems at this point, we have a nice blank slate to work with. Some small Raptor style lettering or lights could be a good add-on later down the road. For now though, this sleek plain grill is looking really good to me. Here's a few pictures of how this grill looks installed on a 2015 Crosstrek. Debadging the grill makes a world of difference in how this vehicle looks. And some of the components behind the grill can make for a great accent too. Well, that's all I have for this video. I hope you liked it, and if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask me. And thanks for watching.